Welcome to the Story Expanded Edition. We continue our series where we're talking about how the Bible is one big story, a complete story, a grand narrative, or sometimes called a meta-narrative, because the Bible isn't just a story, it is a story that explains where we came from, who we are, and why we're here. It is the big story of our lives. It is not just a story that's out there or even a piece of history, but it is telling the story about where we come from, what we're here to do, and what our life is all about. Now, to tell the Bible as one big story, one big meta-narrative, we've broken it up into 7 parts, as you can see symbolized here by each of these symbols. The downward arrow is the symbol of creation. The X is the symbol of the fall or the rebellion that happens in Genesis chapter 3. And then the forward arrow is the promise that comes from Abraham in Genesis 12 and leads all the way to the cross in the New Testament, in the life of Jesus, the Gospels, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. And then from there is another forward arrow, which is the sending out of the church, which is recorded in the book of Acts and the rest of the New Testament. God sending out his people to do something, to share the good news for the world to hear and learn and understand. But then in the future, the story continues with the great check mark, which is the great scene of God's judgment, when God will finally put the world to right and put things back as they should be, which leads us finally to the downward arrow, the last one, which is the restoration, the new creation, the renewal of the whole world. The Bible begins with creation, it ends with new creation. It begins in a garden, it ends in a garden city. It is one big overarching story, and we are right here in the midst of this story, still with the promise. Last time we talked about the promise, I showed you from Genesis 12, the promise God makes to Abraham, and how it finds its fulfillment ultimately in the New Testament in Jesus. Well, I want to continue talking about that today by looking at part 2 of the promise. And by looking at this part, not just thinking about Abraham exclusively, but there is another theme that runs through this whole part of this story. A scarlet thread, somebody once called it, that leads ultimately to Jesus in the New Testament, who is called the Messiah or the Christ. In Hebrew, it's Mashiach, Messiah, in Greek, Christos. Both words translate into English as the Anointed One, referring to the one whom God had chosen and anointed and appointed for a very important task. When you open up the New Testament, the first book in the New Testament is the Gospel of Matthew. The first verse of the New Testament says this. This is Matthew 1:1. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. The New Testament starts by telling us that when you get to the cross, you are actually getting to a place that is a finishing of a big story of Abraham and of David. And this story is about Jesus, the Messiah. A few verses later in Matthew 1:17, after it goes through the genealogy of Jesus, and by the way, it tells the genealogy in a very creative way. It runs 14 generations, and then 14 generations. It says in Matthew 1:17, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. Now, if you stop and look at that, that is a great outline. The Bible's Old Testament story, the story of the Hebrew Bible, the story that we read about from Genesis to Malachi, is a story that goes from Abraham to David, David to exile, and exile to Messiah. That's what I want us to do in the next few minutes, is I want to walk you through this big storyline. And we start where we left off last time talking about Abraham. I want to quickly walk through the story from Abraham through Isaac and through Jacob, and then to the blessing that God makes to the sons of Jacob. Last time I talked through that story, but I left out a really important part of the story, which is the blessing that God makes to Judah in particular. But let's quickly review what we talked about last time. The story starts in creation, goes through the fall, and then leads us to the story of Abraham. Remember, Abraham was a man who lived in a faraway country. God called him to leave his country, go to a promised land. God promised to give him children, to bless him, to make a new people of God, a new nation out of the descendants. God said, your descendants are going to be more numerous than the stars in the sky. But Abraham and Sarah laughed when they heard this kind of thing because they were childless and didn't believe in their old age they could have a child. But God would ultimately honor and bless them in a really remarkable way. This is a picture of Abraham with his big family. Finally, Abraham does have a son by Sarah named Isaac. And Isaac is a major figure as the son of Abraham. Famously, God tells Abraham to take Isaac up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice him and tests Abraham's faith. He ultimately doesn't kill him at all, but proves that Abraham is a man of true faith. Well, Isaac has a son named Jacob. And Jacob is the one who runs away from his brother Esau because he stole the birthright and the blessing of his father. And his brother's angry and he runs away. And he has a dream at Bethel. And God gives him a dream of an ascending staircase. And God promises to bless him. Later he comes back there and he has another dream. And he wrestles with an angel, gets a new name. His new name is Israel, the one who wrestles with God. So the sons of Jacob will become the sons of Israel. And he has 12 sons, hence the 12 tribes. One of those sons is Joseph. Joseph is the firstborn of Jacob's wife, Rachel. And Jacob loved Rachel and therefore looked with favoritism upon Rachel's child, the firstborn of Rachel, Joseph. Gives him, of course, famously the coat of many colors and blesses him in all kinds of incredible ways that makes the older brothers, all envious and jealous. They throw him in a well, sell him as a slave, lives in the house of Potiphar, sits in an Egyptian prison, is rescued finally when he's able to interpret the dream of the Pharaoh of Egypt. In recognition of this, in honor of this, Pharaoh makes him the prince of Egypt. He ends up, because of the famine, rescuing his own family from the famine. They all go and live in Egypt. And they stay there in the land of Goshen, in Egypt. Eventually, they become slaves. The children of Israel living in Egypt become slaves. And they are there for 400 or 500 years until one of the sons is rescued in the Nile River by the daughter of Pharaoh and brought into her home. And because he's drawn out of the water, his name is Moses, which is a name having to do with the water. Drawn out of it, lives in the house of Pharaoh, becomes himself also, like Joseph, the prince of Egypt. And then he finds himself in the desert and has an encounter at the burning bush with God. God says, I want you to go back into Egypt and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses leads Israel out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, back to the mountain, Mount Sinai, and they get the law, the 10 Commandments, God's new covenant with his new nation. Finally, he's answered and fulfilled the promise he made to Abraham. He's given him this huge nation. There's now a nation of people as numerous as the stars in the sky. The only problem is they don't have the land yet. Now they have the law, a new covenant relationship with God in which he promises to bless them. He's making them into a new people, a people who follow him and who are committed and covenanted to him. But they don't have the land yet. Now, we're going to stop that part of the story and we're going to pick it up in just a moment. Because what I want to do is, I told this story last time, is I want to hone in on a particular moment, okay? Before Moses, okay? And during this moment with Joseph, okay? There is at the end of Genesis, okay? Because the story of Moses is in the book of Exodus. Genesis, Exodus are the books of the Old Testament. In the book of Genesis ends with a story of Jacob, father Israel, reaching his arms out and blessing the 12 sons, the 12 tribes, okay? And when he goes through the blessing, it's found in Genesis 49, he blesses each one of the sons. He says, okay, Reuben, I'm going to give you this blessing. And Naphtali, I'm going to give you this blessing. And Simeon, I'm going to give you this blessing. And Benjamin, I'm going to give you this blessing. And one by one, he blesses each of the 12 sons. But as he blesses them, he foreshadows, or you might say even prophetically promises, their future. And he speaks about what their future is going to look like. And he goes through the list of all the different tribes. And when he stops finally at the tribe of Judah, where we get the word Jews today and Judea and all of that, when he gets to Judah and he blesses him, he speaks over Judah and he says that Judah is going to become the lion tribe. Judah is going to be a very special tribe. It's going to be the lion tribe. The French artist Rembrandt painted this scene of how he imagined the elderly, old, wise Jacob Israel anointing, blessing rather, Judah to be this tribe. And then also, this is kind of maybe a little bit more accurate picture of what it would have looked like. You can see Joseph here in kind of Egyptian garb, all the brothers kind of in more traditional nomadic Hebrew garb. And they're sitting around, they're standing around Father Jacob, Father Israel, and he blesses them, kind of on his deathbed, so to speak. And when he gets to Judah, this is what he says. He says, Judah, you are a lion's cub. Just kind of picture a powerful lion. A lion's cub would be the son of a lion. Think Lion King, if you know that Disney movie about the little Simba who grows up to be this powerful lion. He says, you return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? So he's talking about like how powerful and ferocious and intimidating a lion is. If you were to be out in the jungle, if you were to be out in the to be out on a safari or something, and you're just staring face to face with a lion, you are face to face with a ferocious and powerful beast. Jacob, Father Israel, is saying that Judah is that kind of person, that kind of character. He is ferocious and powerful. But he's moving the conversation in a very particular direction, because a lion is, as we would say, king of the jungle, and this is royal language, and we start to see it in what happens next. He says the scepter will not depart from Judah. Now, when you go back and you look, and I meant to show you pictures of this, but if you go and you look at Egyptian rulers, they're often holding a scepter in their hand. Scepters was a way of portraying royalty, particularly divine royalty, that you've been chosen by the gods, if you will, to be in power, and you have this scepter that symbolizes it. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. This is the idea of this ruler who holds this big, powerful staff, symbolizing their rule and their judgment. And it's between his feet, meaning he's just holding it there on his throne, sitting on his throne. Nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read this, I'm kind of like, what's going on here? This is really interesting. I can't make it all out, but it sounds like it's saying that Israel, Jacob, is blessing Judah to be the tribe of kings. And they're going to be the tribe with royal power and warrior prowess like a lion, but not just ruling over the other tribes. But look what it says, the obedience of the nations shall be his, foreshadowing a time when the ruler that Judah will become will be a king of kings, will be a ruler of nations. And then it goes on to say something really interesting. It says, he will tether his donkey to a vine. Now, I don't know if you understand that language. In Israel, vineyards are everywhere. Wine production is a major source of agricultural revenue. And a donkey will eat whatever you attach it to, right? So if you were to tie your donkey to something, you'd want to tie your donkey to a bunch of hay maybe, or something that's not very expensive. To put it attached to a vine where it could eat the vine, eat the grapes, destroy what is super valuable, which is your vine, only the richest of the rich would let their donkey eat a vine. It'd be like someone saying, I let my dog eat filet mignon off the dinner table. In other words, this ruler, this Judah guy, is going to be super powerful, and he is going to be, and he's going to be super rich, right? His cult to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine. What's that mean? I mean, it's not like a literal kind of thing. It's just saying he's going to be so rich, he washes his garments in wine. You know, we have sayings about that. I don't want to use them, but people wipe themselves with $100 bills or something like that. You know, this is an image of incredible wealth. Incredible wealth. His robes he washes them in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. This is the idea of just having such opulence and having such a beauty and having such physical characteristics that he's just trying to describe how Judah is really going to be handsome and rich and powerful and have it all. Judah's getting the blessing of being the tribe of the king, okay? Now, when you were working our way through the Bible and trying to understand it as a story, and we get to a verse like this, what I have to kind of do is I have to tell you something here, and I'm doing that in this lesson today, in which you need to know that the texts as they were recorded in the Bible began to be interpreted and reinterpreted in new ways later on. So that later on people would read that verse and they would read it in the light of the new circumstances. And by the time you get to the New Testament, you have a clear example of what I would call a messianic interpretation. You say, what does that mean? That means that in the New Testament time, in the time of Jesus, people were reading verses in the Old Testament, these old stories, these old blessing passages, in a way that was fresh and in a way that was particularly directed at Jesus himself. And I want to show you how that set of verses in Genesis 49 is read in the New Testament in reference to Jesus in two passages. Revelation 5:5. Revelation 5:5 is the passage that says, do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals. In this passage in the New Testament, we are told that Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is the Root of David. He's triumphed and he's able to open the scroll. What it's saying here is it's using the imagery of Genesis 49 to talk about Jesus. At the end of the book of Revelation, it says this in Revelation 22:6. I, Jesus, have sent my angel, 22:16. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, the bright and morning star. Now, what these two verses are doing is they are taking these Old Testament verses and they are reinterpreting them in reference to Jesus as the Messiah. Okay, so what we just did is we went from Genesis, we talked about the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. I told you about Moses. Now, after this, after that, there's a whole other set of stories. And just like we started with looking at Matthew, where it said, and then from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, from the exile to the Messiah, I want us to look at the next part of this, which is not the part from Abraham to Judah, but the part from Israel to King David. All right? So let's review, because we talked about this a little bit last time. If you want to kind of, in your mind, think about Moses has led the Israelites out of Egypt. They've gotten the law. They've come to Mount Sinai, gotten the law. Now they're going to go into the promised land and take it, except they don't. If you remember the story, they wander around in the wilderness for 40 years because they don't have the faith to take the land. They stay at a place called, I told you last time, Kadesh Barnea, where there were some springs there. And they're stuck there and they don't go in. Moses will eventually die, and it will be Joshua that will lead the Israelites into and make conquest of the land. The Israelites were spend a lot of time down here. This is Kadesh Barnea. And then they would, under Moses, they would make their way up to right here on the edge of Jericho, on the other side of the Jordan River. And then Moses will die on the mountain, Mount Nebo. And then Joshua will lead them across the Jordan River. They will take the battle of Jericho, and then they'll take all this other territory, and they'll conquer. And after they conquer all this, they distribute it up into 12 tribal allotments. And you can see the tribes: Simeon, Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, Dan, Manasseh. These are the sons of Jacob, and Ephraim and Manasseh are the sons of Joseph. So those become the 12 tribes and the 12 regions. And here's the one I was just talking about, Judah, and how important that one is. And that is because after the Israelites took the land under Joshua, they never got their act together. Go read the book of Judges in the Old Testament, and it tells about how everybody did what was right in their own eyes. They didn't really follow the ways of God. They didn't really follow the covenant that God had made with them. And so God gets tired of it, and he acts in a very particular way. He sends a prophet named Samuel to anoint a man named Saul to become king. I told you before, the reason they made him king, he was the tallest man in the land. But he's a terrible king, and so God tells Samuel to anoint David to become king. David is a shepherd. He's just a boy. He's the son of a man named Jesse, who has a lot of older children, but God doesn't look on the outside. He looks on the heart, is the famous line from that story. And David will go and kill Goliath, and he'll get this great reputation as this great warrior. He will work under Saul for a long time as this great military genius. Saul's jealous. Everybody talks about how David is a better warrior than him. You know, Saul kills his thousands. David kills his tens of thousands. It's kind of the story of the Old Testament. And Saul gets angry and tries to kill David. Eventually, Saul dies. He's killed in battle against the Philistines. And David becomes king. And when David becomes king and is anointed, he eventually will become anointed king, not just of Judah, and he is of the tribe of Judah, but he will become king of the whole land of Israel. And he will unite the whole empire underneath himself. Now, did you catch what I said? He is from the tribe of Judah. And in Judah, there is a place that he will make the capital called Jerusalem. And Jerusalem will become the capital not just of Judah, but it will become the capital of all of Israel. The united tribes of Israel under the leadership of a single king named David, and then later his son Solomon. And then after that, the kingdom becomes divided north and south. Israel will be in the north, Judah will be in the south. But that's kind of the review of that big story we told last time. Now, I want to do the same thing again that I did a moment ago, which I want to back up to a particular moment and show you how something happens here of messianic significance, of significance related to the promise of a Messiah. And if we were to back it up, we would back it up to actually right before all of this takes place. All right, before Joshua conquers, before Saul and David and all this actually takes place. Right before all this happens, the Israelites under Moses are encamped in the wilderness on the edge of the promised land. And the people that are living in that land over here are really nervous because they see this huge nation, this army of people. And one man in particular, one king in particular, calls on a prophet, a famous prophet named Balaam, to do something really incredible. He wants Balaam, this really famous prophet, to come down, look at the armies of Israel who are encamped, and pronounce a curse over them. He wants his army to be emboldened by the prophet's message that Israel's cursed. Then he wants the Israelites to be afraid that God is against them. And so he's trying to create this moment of propaganda. So he calls on Balaam to come and make this prophecy. Balaam builds 7 altars, and he's going to make this prophecy over. But what happens along the way is that God speaks to the prophet named Balaam. Balaam's going down the road. This is one of the stories, if you've ever heard it, is Balaam and his donkey. And he's riding down the road, and he's trying to get there so he can pronounce this blessing or curse over Israel. And his donkey won't go any further forward. And he gets mad, and he starts beating the donkey. I mean, he's ready to beat it to death, he says. When suddenly God opens his eyes and makes him realize that there's an angel standing in front of him blocking the way. And he realizes, oh, I should have been beating my donkey. God was standing in my way. Well, that message in that story that comes to Balaam is God is also blessing Israel, and he is standing in the way of Balaam going there to curse him. That's the message. So Balaam knows that he's not going to go and pronounce a blessing, even though he's been paid to do that. He's going to go and pronounce a curse. So the moment comes, and he stands and he speaks out, and he makes these 7 altars, and he speaks out over the Israelites who are in camp there. And instead of cursing, he blesses. And not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. And the king that paid him to come and curse is so livid, he's so angry that he's paid this guy to go and curse the Israelites, but God has forced Balaam to bless them instead. And it becomes this incredible moment in which you get a sense in the Bible that God is with his people Israel. But something important is said in this moment. It's in Numbers 24, verse 17, that as Balaam pronounces his blessing over the nation of Israel rather than a curse, he begins to prophesy into the future. And he says in Numbers 24:17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab and the skulls of all the people of Sheth. As he looks out, Balaam says that he sees that a star is going to come, a scepter will rise. That's a ruler, that's a king. And in fact, that does happen in the form of David, right? This great king will emerge. But that verse of Scripture speaks not only of the coming of David, the lion of the tribe of Judah in the Old Testament. It becomes a foreshadowing of what will happen ultimately in Jesus. And this is, again, what I call a messianic interpretation. Later on, people will read that verse in reference to a second Messiah, a second royal king, a second anointed figure who will come, and particularly in reference to Jesus. We see this in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 through 2, it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, and they asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. This is a famous story of the 3 wise men, the 3 wise guys, the Magi that come from the east. They're astrologers from Babylon, and they see a star in the sky, and they go, oh, wow, look, a king is born in Jerusalem. We're going to go there. What's interesting is that in the book of Numbers that we just read, it foretold a day when a star would rise. Well, at the birth of Jesus, there was a star that rose. There was a star in the sky. There was a fulfillment of, you might say, prophecy that points to those readers in that day realizing that Jesus was the one that Balaam spoke of. Now, when you read in the Old Testament about this kind of thing, and these are those 3 wise men, by the way, we don't know that there were 3. They brought 3 gifts. We don't know the actual number of them. But if you want to find a connection to this, in the Christmas story, when Jesus is born, he's born in what town? He's born in Bethlehem. Why is that important? That's David's hometown, actually. David, who was from the tribe of Judah, was from Bethlehem. And the Old Testament, in the book of Micah, said that in the future, God would send another ruler who would also be born in Bethlehem. Micah 5:2 says, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." And so that Christmas night 2,000 years ago when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there was an understanding related to these verses, and by the way, many others, that Jesus was the fulfillment in a messianic sense of this great, long, desired and waited for prophecy and promise from Scripture and from the Old Testament. In other words, Jesus was the fulfillment of a great big story. And when you pick up the New Testament book of Matthew, it starts by telling us about Jesus the Messiah. It goes from Abraham to David, and then from David to the exile, and from the exile to the Messiah, Jesus. Well, we just did the first two parts of that, so let's finish with the third part, from the exile to the Messiah. So if you don't remember what exile means, this is a reference to the captivity of the Israelites, and I'll review it here. There are two major periods after David ruled in Israel and Solomon ruled, and then after the empire was divided north and south. There were two periods in which the nation was attacked. The northern kingdom of Israel was attacked in the year 722 BC, and they were conquered by the Assyrian Empire. So this is Israel here. Assyria was this vast nation that had taken over the whole world. They'd conquered Babylon and Syria, and they came down and they took Israel to the north. But they left Judah to the south. And Judah was where the sons of David ruled as kings for generation after generation. Well, in the year 586 BC, a new empire arose on the scene, the Babylonians, and they came and they swept in 605, as well as finally in 586, they conquered, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and they took everybody that was anybody captive back into Babylon. They'd already taken Daniel back there in about 605 BC. Then they took all the kings, and that wipes out the royal family. You see, from the time of David, which was he ruled in 1000 BC, to this time, which was in 586 BC, there had been 400 plus years of a son of David ruling on the throne of Jerusalem. There had been one long Davidic dynasty, one long period of a monarchy. But then afterwards, after this, there will never again be a king reigning in Judea and Jerusalem who is a descendant of David. This leads us to our third big messianic interpretation conversation. And to understand it, we have to look at the Davidic promise. God made David king, not just of Judah, but of all of Israel. And after he conquered the foreign nations of the Philistines and everything else and united the empire, David really wanted to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the temple, into Jerusalem, and build a temple there inside the temple, inside of Jerusalem, so that the house of God and the house of worship would be right there in Jerusalem, where his palace was. And he asked the prophet Nathan if he could do this, and Nathan consulted with God and came back and said, yeah, you can do it. And then God said, wait a minute, no, actually, that's not what I want to do, actually. You want to build a house for me? Actually, I want to build a house for you, David. I want to build a dynasty for you that will last forever. That's what God will say to him. And so he will found the house of David. He will tell him that he wants to have his house to continue to be in place forever and ever. And I'll show you those verses in just a moment. Before I read those verses, I want to show you something kind of interesting. In the north of Israel, one of the most northern places in Israel is called Dan. I've been there a number of times. And archaeologists discovered something there very important a few years ago. They found this stone on this rock that is really, really old. This is called the Tel Dan stele. And it's a fragmentary stele, but it contains a Canaanite inscription with a date from the 9th century BC, so 900 years before Christ. And it's notable because it contains the most significant extra-biblical archaeological reference to David. And it actually uses right here the phrase, the house of David, meaning that in the 900s BC, after the time of David coming to power, that we know from an archaeological and historical perspective that David really lived, that he had a real royal family and a real royal dynasty. It's not just something you read about in the Bible and you, oh, I hope that's true. We know that it is true. Well, this is the thing God said to David in 2 Samuel 7:8. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture. David was a shepherd when God called him to be a king, anointed him to be a king. The word again, anointed, Hebrew Messiah, Greek Christos, Christ, when he made him a Messiah, when he anointed him, from tending the flock and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. God made David ruler. People didn't elect David. God anointed and chose him for the task. It was a divinely appointed task. In 2 Samuel 7:11, this is a few verses later, and it says, have I not done since the time I appointed leaders of my people? I also will give you rest from your enemies. And then God makes this promise. The Lord declares to you, the Lord himself will establish a house for you, the house of David. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, in other words, when you're dead, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. And he does, Solomon, and then every other ruler in the history of that nation until the Babylonian exile was a son of David. Your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. But then look what it says next. He is the one who will build a house for my name. Now, if you know your Bible, you know that this is Solomon is the one who finally builds the temple, right? Solomon's temple. He's the one who will build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I'll punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him. And as I took away from Saul, whom I removed from before you, your house, your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Now, what God promises David here is absolutely incredible. We can spend a lot of time just talking about how incredible it is that God promises David a forever kingdom. He makes him a promise like he does Abraham, that he is going to have a forever king ruling on the throne. Which leads us to the problem, which is with the Babylonian exile, which is there wasn't a king. And for 400 years, from 586 BC to the time of Jesus, there was no king, which leads us kind of into the New Testament period where we're waiting for and wondering, is God ever going to honor those promises and send us a Messiah? By the way, that's also what all the prophets are in the Old Testament. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets, you know, from Amos to Malachi, they are all telling a story that says that God is going to honor this promise, and he's going to send a new David. He's going to send a new king. He's going to have a forever kingdom, and God is going to do this. And the language that's used in the New Testament for this is that he is going to be not just a Messiah, not just an anointed one, but he is going to be the anointed one, the forever Messiah, the King, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Well, as we think through this part of the Bible, there are so many verses of Scripture I could point to. I just wanted to give you a few to kind of frame your thoughts. But this is what the prophets of the Old Testament talk about. But just look at a few of these. Amos 9:11, this is a minor prophet. Amos says that in that day I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls, restore its ruins. I will rebuild it as it used to be. Amos says, Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem. They took away your king. I will restore David's fallen tent, or David's fallen shelter. In other words, I'm going to restore the Davidic rule in Jerusalem. Isaiah 11:1. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Who's Jesse? That's David's daddy in the Old Testament, right? In the book of Samuel. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From its roots, a branch will bear fruit. There is going to be a son of David, a Messiah of Israel that's going to arise. Isaiah 9:6, for to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. You know, if he has a government on his shoulders, that means he's going to be a king. Mighty God, Everlasting Father, these are his names. Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and the peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. And the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. God himself is going to make it come about. There's going to be not just a Messiah, but there is going to be the Messiah. And that gets us to the New Testament, right? Because these prophecies, and there are so many more that I could show you, that promise that God is going to do what he said he was going to do, not just in Abraham, but also in David, find their fulfillment in a dramatic moment in the New Testament. It's in Luke's gospel that we have the scene of an angel coming to a woman, a young woman living in Nazareth of Galilee. She comes to him with an announcement. We call it the Annunciation of Mary. That's the woman's name, Miriam. This young woman, this virgin pledged to be married to Joseph, gets news that God is at last going to do this thing that he said he was going to do. She is going to have a miraculous conception, and she's going to give birth to a child who is going to become the fulfillment of all these hopes and all these dreams and all these promises that we read about in the Old Testament. This is what the scripture describes in Luke 1:29. Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary. You found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son. You're to call him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. He'll be called the Son of God. That's what God said was going to happen when he was promising David back in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that we read earlier, sometimes called the Florilegium in Latin, the promise that God out of the lineage of David would bring about this Messiah, this Son of David, this Son of God. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever, and his kingdom will never end. And that's how the Messianic promise, the Messiah promise, can be traced to the entire Old Testament. That what God promised to Abraham and then would later promise to David would find its fulfillment in the New Testament in the story of Jesus. And this is just one more part in this unfolding story, the great story, the grand narrative that is our Bible, the story that starts with creation and ends in new creation, that includes fall but also promised and hoped for not only the sons of Abraham but the promise of David, that finds its fulfillment in the Son of David, the Messiah, Jesus, which we'll learn about next time as we continue to tell the story. But as always, I want to ask the question of you, where are you in the story? What's your place in the story? Have you found your place in the story in terms of Jesus? Do you know what it is that he has come to do for you? Are you in this place of the story where you're on this side of the cross and you've not yet come to make this story your story? Or are you a person who's made the cross a part of your life story, part of your story? And so now God is sending you out to share that good news with other people, waiting for the day of his judgment and the day of his restoration. It's important for all of us to think about where we are in the story to figure out what God would want us to do as a next step in the story. This is our schedule so far. So if you're just kind of wondering where we are, introduction, creation, rebellion, promise. We skipped a week and we just did promise 2 just now. And then after that, next time we're going to look at the redemption, then followed by the mission, the judgment, and the restoration. I'll see you next time for the rest of the story.